My name is Alva Hodson, nickname Al, alias Bud when I was a boy. I'm 90 years old and I was a B-24 bomber pilot in World War II. I finished high school in Peoria, Illinois in June of 1942. Obviously the war was underway and I enlisted at age 18 in the aviation cadet program and was accepted for assignment into the Air Corps unclassified. I wasn't called until January of 1943 after submitting all of the necessary information, and was inducted into the Air Corps unassigned to report to San Antonio, Texas in the classification program. After a series of tests, I was assigned as a pilot for pilot training. For pre-flight, I stayed right at San Antonio, Texas, and went through ground school training, upper underclassmen hazing training, and of course the marching, etc. as far as military training goes. After that, I was assigned to primary training in El Reno, Oklahoma, just outside of Oklahoma City. I was flying then. The trainer that was used in that area was a Fairchild PT-19A, where after a few hours of solo training, the instructor would have you land in a pasture somewhere, just a green grass pasture, and he'd have you taxi back and tell you to stop, and he'd get out of the airplane and take all the papers with him because he wanted to make sure they had a record in case of a crash. And he would say, "You're going to solo now." And I went on and completed my primary training, and I was assigned then to basic training in a PT-13 Vultee. It was called a Vultee Vibrator. And I was assigned to Strother Field in Winfield, Kansas, where I took training in a heavier airplane, still a single engine. And eventually, after a certain number of hours in military testing there, acrobatics, some cross country, I was graduated from that school and sent on to, in my case, a twin-engine advanced training school at Amarillo, Texas, where I flew a Cessna, and it was a twin-engine side-by-side Cessna side-by-side cockpit. There was a lot of cross-country in that airplane, a lot of learning to fly the airways, just getting acquainted with more distant trips until graduation from twin engine, where commissions were issued and assignments to combat airplane. In my particular case, I was assigned to a 4-engine school. By this time, you're a second lieutenant commissioned pilot in the Army Air Corps, the old Army Air Corps. And I went to Fort Worth, Texas at the Consolidated Production Plant in Fort Worth, and flew out of their field and became acquainted with the 4-engine bomber that I would fly, and was assigned from there to Marchfield, California for crew training. I picked up a crew, 9-man crew plus myself, at Hammerfield, Fresno, California, and had a co-pilot assigned, a bombardier, a navigator, a flight engineer, a radio operator, an armament man, and 3 gunners. And we trained for several months at Marchfield as a crew. From there we were assigned to Fairfield, California for overseas shipment in April of, I believe it was April of 1943. Flew a crew from Fairfield, California to Hickmanfield, Hawaii, and started a combat crew there. The graduation from flying school was from twin engine advanced in Pampa, Texas in November of 1943. Pampa, Texas was not a large town. I don't recall that they even had more than one hotel, and it was not a big one. But every graduating class, which occurred each month during the war, that is aviation cadet graduation class, many of the parents would come to town, and since there weren't places for them to be lodged, the town would open up their homes for the parents to come and view the graduation, pin the wings on their kids, and who are now pilots in the Air Corps. Quite a thing for a town like that, and many acquaintances were kept for a lot of years after that between the visitors and the townspeople in Pampa, Texas. The flight from Fairfield, California to Hickenfield, Hawaii had been after a long delay of weather. Well, during the long stay there, morale got pretty low, and one evening, just sitting around in the officers' club and passing the time, somebody hollered attention. Everybody popped to, and General Hap Arnold walked through the door into the officers' club and put everybody at ease. And he called for a short snorter showdown. I doubt if many people ever heard of a short snorter, but what that was, when called for, everyone would pull out their so-called short snorter, which would be a series of bills of currency, dollar bills. Some of them were more than $1, some of them were different country denominations, and they would be taped together with Scotch tape and just interfolded. And then when the showdown occurred, they would be passed around. Everybody present would sign on them. So that's how I got General Hap Arnold's signature on my short snorter. And of course, then the one that didn't have the short snorter was the one that would pay for the round of drinks. And in this case, Hap Arnold, the general, declared he didn't have a short snorter, so he bought everybody a round of drinks, obviously. After a nice visit with him, he left, and we sweated out some more time until we were finally cleared off. Late one evening, it was already dark, and we got a clearance in short notice because of a break in the weather. So we happened to be the first one off. We got cleared off. I always wanted to fly under the Golden State Bridge, but I couldn't because of the weather and the darkness, and I went straight out and just was instantly on weather. I never even saw the bridge go under me, and we were in weather until the next morning when we broke out in daylight over the Hawaiian Islands. It was weather all the way. Shortly after takeoff, going back to that point, my radio operator, Chuck Gibson, tapped me on the shoulder, and he said the plane that took off behind us, which was a rank crew, they were all high-ranked officers that had been cleared out of the training command, they had taken off behind us and hadn't gone far when they radioed for a clearance back in again, so they decided not to make the trip and turned around and I presume landed. I never heard from them again. We obviously kept going until we, as I said, got to Hawaii the next morning and came in on Molokai, which wasn't far off of Diamond Head Point of Oahu, and that was all on the navigator's good job of dead reckoning all the way. Couldn't even get a celestial shot in the weather. So we made the approach to Hawaii. In those days, we didn't dare go straight in and land because of the experience they had with the Japanese attack. You'd come in on Diamond Head, circle north and around the island to the left, 2 miles off course, off the shoreline, and go all the way around the island to the left, and then come in on Pearl Harbor and Hickenfield and approach your landing straight in. And that was the first I saw of wartime damage, was making a turn onto the final and letting down onto the runway at Hickam, and seeing the bottom repaired marks on the ground, the broken parts of the corners of buildings that hadn't been repaired, just the general scars and demolitions, marks still there from the attack on Pearl Harbor. And you realize then that from now on training was practically over, and this was wartime, just brought home in real time. While at Marchfield in the States, I had met a man who was in uniform, a Navy man, 8 hash marks on his sleeve, a chief petty officer, and his name was PL. His initials were PL. His nickname was Spud, which is what he went by, Spud Murphy. And he had a crew-cut hair. He was a muscled up guy who looked like he could have been a fighter, and in fact he had been. And he had said, if you come to Hawaii, because we didn't know at that point whether we would go to Europe or whether we would go to the Pacific. So since we went to the Pacific, we got in touch with, I'm saying the 4 officers of my crew, because we were together, we were the ones that met him, along with the 4 officers of one other crew whose pilot was named Beerworth. So Beerworth's crew and my crew, Hodson's crew, we did look him up. We called from a place called the Willard Inn one weekend afternoon, the first week afternoon we were over there. And the Willard Inn was an officers club on Waikiki Beach, near the old Royal Hawaiian Hotel. It's a nice grassy high spot on the beach overlooking the ocean. And it had a parquet dance floor. It had a thatched roof building where the bar was and the drinks were served, and then the tables and chairs were right out on the grass behind the fence entrance, the fenced off entrance up on the boulevard. So that's where we contacted Spud, and he said, stay where you are, I'm going to send a couple of cars down to pick you up. So sure enough, here come a couple of servicemen, Navy men, were driving big limousine type cars, and they contacted us and picked the 8 of us up and took us up to Spud's home, and found out that he lived in a huge palatial mansion, which had been the home of Dole the Pineapple King. He had the big house on front. There were quarters behind, large quarters behind the house where we stayed, that is the 8 of us. He had housekeepers and cooks and whatever else. He asked us what we wanted for dinner that night, because it was, by this time it was mid-afternoon, and we wanted chicken. So he told his woman to fix a whole chicken for each one of us. And before he left us, he said, we were having a little house party, is the way he put, a little house party to him. About 8 o'clock, come on up to the house. And he said, and it'll just go on to whatever is comfortable for you. So we eventually went up to the house party, and it was a huge party. There were Navy officers, just all kinds of rank naval officers all over the place. The mayor of Honolulu was there. So anyway, quite a party there, and during the course of the evening I wandered into Spud's private office, which was, everything was open, and he had a picture on his desk with FDR shaking his hand and handing him some kind of a medal, and there was another picture on his desk of Jack Dempsey handing him a medal. So he'd been quite an athlete during his Navy career, and was obviously well recognized by both President Roosevelt and Jack Dempsey. One of the more interesting things while we were in Hawaii was a weekend at the Willard Inn on Waikiki Beach, which is an officers club. And while we were there was a little commotion at the front gate with some activity with people moving around, and Charlie Swan, who was the bombardier on my crew, looked over at what was going on and said, "I know those people." He said, "That's Bob Hope." And he jumped up and was going to go over there. And I said, "Charlie, let them have a good time. They're just relaxing on their own. They're not here to entertain." And he said, "Hell, I know them personally." He said, "They're friends of mine." So he went over and brought the party back to the table. It was Bob Hope, Jerry Colonna, and I believe the singers, there was one female singer with him, I believe it was Frances Langford. Sure enough, Bob Hope and his wife knew Charlie's mom and dad in Oklahoma City. They were personal friends and visited when Bob Hope was in Oklahoma City. And I believe Charlie Swan's father was a contractor in Oklahoma City. Anyway, they were friends. And we had a good time visiting and got signatures and short Snorters signed and so forth with Bob Hope's group there. It's quite a day. While on rest leave from the 40 combat missions, we visited Spud. And when I say we, that's again, it's the 4 officers on my crew and the 4 officers on Herman Beerwer's crew. We contacted Spud, and he had us come out to his place and wanted to know what we wanted to see while we were on rest leave. And we said we would like to see something at the submarine base, because as we bombed the different islands, there would always be a Navy submarine would surface not too far off the island to radio in or to pick up any one that was had to bail out or was shot down. And he said, let me pick up the telephone. So right there in his house, he dialed and got a hold of somebody at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. And when he hung up, he said, well, he said, you're going to be the guests of Admiral Lockwood on his sub down at the naval base. I didn't know at the time, and he explained that Admiral Lockwood is in charge of all submarine activity in the Pacific Ocean area. He was the top commander of submarine activity in the Navy in the Pacific. So sure enough, we go down to the sub-harbor and we're escorted onto his submarine and taken to him in his quarters, where we all sat and talked. And we had a lunch on board. When talking with him, he asked us such things as, did we see his subs out there? And of course, we did. They were called Dumbo. It was a Dumbo that would surface, a Dumbo that would rescue. That was the Navy term for it, or the code word, I should say. And we had quite a conversation with him, and nothing but complimentary. The Pacific War was a Navy war, although the Air Corps, the Army Air Corps in those days, was assigned to the Navy in the Pacific. We were under their command, and we were second-class citizens as far as food was concerned, as far as other privileges were concerned. The Navy was first, and then the Army Air Corps, if it was available. But the Admiral was first class with us all the way. Anyway, he was the Admiral that had the responsibility of determining what was wrong as far as the Navy torpedoes problem that they had early in the war. The submarine would fire the torpedo, and the torpedo somehow would not hit the target. It would do 180 and come back to where it was fired, or near where it was fired. So he was the one that finally determined what was the problem, got it straightened out, and after the war, a movie was made starring John Wayne, a movie called Operation Pacific. Our combat missions in the Pacific area during the time of 43, 44, 45 when I was out there, were missions that averaged at least 12 hours. Some of them were 10-hour missions, some of them were 15-hour missions. But typical mission, there would be a briefing the day before takeoff. And since the missions were long, we'd get the airplane ready the evening before for an early morning takeoff. We'd get every inch of or every ounce of fuel into the tanks that could be squeezed in, which meant that they were filled to the brim. The caps were put on in safety, and you would want to be off of the ground before the sun beat on the aluminum wings, expanding the fuel and causing it to leak out of the airplane. So we would always have an early morning takeoff, and outbound takeoff was not a problem. We had plenty of runway, and there were no trees on the end of the island at Squadron, at least, and we had no trouble getting in the air. But we'd climb to altitude at generally around 10,000 feet or a little below going out, and the concern was always power settings, keeping the RPMs even on the engine. If they got out of synchronization at all, you could hear the sound immediately because you were trained to the synchronized prop, and you did everything you could to keep them synchronized immediately, to hold down the drag, to keep the airplane on the step, to keep it trimmed, and to get maximum fuel usage because your airplane was heavy. You had the full plane load, the fuel bomb load. We'd take off about 85,000 pounds gross weight, which is a lot in those days. And we would climb to altitude when we got within an hour or so of the target. But on the way out, there was plenty to be busy with and be concerned about. There wasn't any time when you could just relax and forget about combat or forget about anything. There was always plenty to watch. Everything was maximum performance because you had to get back to land to get that airplane down. They did not make good water landings. So we, on the way out, about an hour out, as I said, climbed to altitude, put on the oxygen mask at 10,000 feet. When we got to altitude, we would have the test firing of the guns to do. After that, everything was combat ready. The flak vests were always worn, the parachute was always worn. You would have a bailout bottle, which is oxygen bottle, ready in case you needed it in emergencies. And you would be all set up at the time you reach your altitude before the bomb run or before any fighters would attack you. Since we were too far out to have top cover or to have fighter protection ourselves, the enemy would always have a twin-engine plane. It was a twin-engine Jap Betty, and it would join our formation out of 50 caliber range, fly parallel with us at the same altitude, stay with us through all the turns and whatnot, and be radioing back the pertinent information for their gunners on the ground, their radar-controlled guns and searchlights, if it was night, that they would have on the ground, and they'd have accurate information to set up a barrage for us when we crossed the target. So there never was a time when you when you didn't have concerns. Over the target, of course, was the greatest. And after the bomb's away and out of range of the fighters, the first thing you would do is check your fuel and then all of the positions, of course, to see that everybody was still healthy, and get ready for the long trip back home. Our fourth mission was from the island of Kwajalein, staging through Eniwetok, and we stayed at Eniwetok overnight to be able to take an early morning takeoff as the sun came up, and the target was the Truk Atoll. That was always a primary target in the Pacific. It was a real Pacific stronghold of the Japanese. Truk was a entire atoll that had 5 large major Japanese islands within the atoll. For years before the war, they built this up as a Pacific base, the Japanese did. Over one of the islands, I think it was Eaton Island, E-T-E-N, which had a runway on it, as did several of the major islands in there. We were hit by flak, which was not uncommon, but this particular piece of flak was uncommonly large. It hit us in the right wing, between number 3 and number 4 engine, right into the leading edge of the wing, and lodged up against the fuel line. It naturally stayed there throughout the mission until we got back to Kwajalein, and the ground crew dug it out and gave it to me. Fuel supply was not interrupted, and we were able to get safely back to the base without problems from that incident. The 11th Bomb Group was comprised of like 4 squadrons. Squadron 431 was a squadron I was in. There was a Squadron 98. There was a Squadron 26. And a Squadron, let's see, what was the other one? Squadron, 42nd Squadron. It was not unusual to have several squadrons in a group mission. And on this particular mission that I'm describing now, a pilot from the 98th Squadron was in an airplane called the Coconut Queen, and that was airplane 992, I believe was the number, the Coconut Queen. We had hit Truk again on that mission, and I had just landed, and then we talked. And the island was covered with Navy planes. Admiral Halsey's task force had come into the Anahuac Atoll, and when that would occur, the Navy ships would come inside the lagoon, and the naval planes on the carriers would take off the carriers and land on the island. The wings would be folded up on them, and then they would be stacked up on the island along the runway like cordwood. So when the bombers came in and the Navy was there, you didn't have a lot of room on the island, and you certainly didn't have any room off of the runways. You had to stay right on the runway. So I had just landed, as I said before, and taxied back to the upper end, the landing end of the island. You would follow, you'd land, and a Jeep would have a follow me sign, and then you just go where they told you to park. And so I followed them back and parked where they told me, on the touchdown end of the runway, facing the runway, maybe just a few feet off of the edge of the runway. And had parked, had set the brakes, had taken off my headset, turned off the radio, getting ready to get out, and most of the crew was already out of the airplane. And I looked back up toward direction it had come from, had landed from, and here comes a B-24 in on this final landing. It was very low, and it didn't have its wheels down. And I immediately put my headset on and turned on the radio so I could listen to the tower, and I heard him tell the pilot on the airplane, ditch the B-24 in the lagoon. And he said, clear the runway, I'm coming in. And the next thing I heard was, I think it was, called himself a commander. Anyway, he said, this is like Commander so-and-so, and he mentioned his name. And he said, this is an order, ditch that B-24 in the lagoon. And the next voice was the pilot of the airplane. He said, this is Major Benish, go to hell and clear the runway, I'm coming in. And that's exactly what he did. He touched down not too far from where I was up against the runway, and he came in hot, which was not standard operating procedure then. It was to come in slow and just float until you touched down. And he came in hot and just kind of like flew it right into the ground. and it didn't go very far at all. I mean, it stopped quickly. It didn't seem to hurt it at all. And the men jumped out and ran from the airplane, and a crane immediately came down to the runway and hitched up there's I think 3 attach points, and lifted that airplane up off of the ground just very quickly. And they went to move it off of the runway. They kind of lurched it, and something gave way, snapped the rig, the airplane dropped straight down to the ground. And that time dust flew everywhere. And they immediately hooked it up again, got it up in the air, and took it away. And the runway was available again, which was their great concern because there was no other runway.